I'm Russell Rowland, and this is The Song of Rowland, a podcast about American culture. And today I'm going to talk about, I've published 8 books. So as you can probably imagine, I love books. But that wasn't always the case. I was kind of a late bloomer when it came to reading, and also when it came to writing. So today I want to talk about some books that influenced me or actually shaped the way I approach writing. Just books that influenced me in different ways. And I was going to try to keep it to 10, but I couldn't. There's too many. So I'm going to talk about 12 books today. And I don't have anything written down. I'm just going to talk very spontaneously about these books that have been important to me. And hopefully I'll inspire you to explore some new books that you haven't read or even heard of. So I want to start with Giants of the Earth by Ole Rolvog. This is a book that a lot of people in America were assigned in high school. I think maybe it was just a Western thing, but I read this book in high school. And it was one of the first books I read. And it's a huge book. It's very long. But it was one of the first books I read that just had me completely absorbed. And, a lot of it probably had to do with the subject matter. It's about a farming family. My mother grew up on a ranch in Montana. So there was a lot about the characters and about the lifestyle that definitely resonated with me, but it was also just the way that Rolvog writes about the landscape and about the way that people in that kind of environment deal with conflict, the lack of communication that often goes on in ranch families and farm families. This book just really spoke to me, and it was one that I just couldn't put down once I got absorbed. So that one stuck with me for a long time, and I'm pretty sure that when I started writing about my own family history, which I've done quite a bit, this book was a huge influence on the approach that I took to those books. So that's number 1. Number 2, quite a departure from number 1. This one is Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. So this book came to me, I went through a very dark phase right after high school. I went to college in Tacoma, Washington, and immediately dove into a pretty dark world of drinking and drugs. I was homesick and just dealing with a lot of insecurities, etc. Anyway, I went downhill pretty fast. And it wasn't too long after I graduated from college that I actually realized I needed help. And in large part because my father checked himself into a treatment program when I was a senior in college. So I was very fortunate to be introduced to recovery through him. Anyway, when I got sober, I was 23 when I first started going to meetings. I fell in love with books again. I hadn't been able to read for quite a while. In fact, it was a struggle for me to get through college because the drinking affected my attention span so badly that I couldn't concentrate. I would try to read, and I just didn't have the focus or the attention span. So I was staying with a friend of mine, a cousin actually, in Seattle, and he had a large collection of books, and including almost every Kurt Vonnegut book. And I picked up Breakfast of Champions, and was just immediately taken by Vonnegut's humor, but is also his imagination. He was really good at creating alternative worlds that were just a little off kilter, but also were grounded in reality in a way. So he poked fun of society in ways that were fun, but also very insightful and provocative. And I immediately fell in love with his writing. I read almost all of his books. I don't think I've missed more than just a few. And, a lot of the people on this list are like that. A lot of writers on this list are people that I read one of their books and I just couldn't get enough. So I would um, go on a bender, basically. The third book I'm going to talk about is Mrs. Bridge by Evan Connell. So I was in graduate school when I was in my early 30s. I had fallen in love with writing and decided I wanted to be a writer. While I was in the Navy, I was stationed in Connecticut. So I was right up the street from Connecticut College and I took some writing classes, put together just enough of a portfolio that I applied to graduate school. And I was very fortunate to get into Boston University, which was a really very good program. There was a woman I met. She wasn't part of the program, but she was also in another graduate program who told me about this book called Mrs. Bridge. And I had never heard of Evan Connell, but I read the book. And one of the things that is so brilliant about Mrs. Bridge and also the sequel, which is Mr. Bridge, and if those names are familiar to you, it might be because Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward made a film called Mr. and Mrs. Bridge based on these books. Evan Connell grew up in Missouri, Kansas City, and they are based on his family. Basically, each chapter is a snapshot. There's no plot to the book. There's no chronological storyline. Each chapter is pretty short, with just a few exceptions, but they all create just enough of an image of what this family is about and how they interact with each other, the family dynamics, that together it forms this incredible portfolio, this portrait of a family. And it's just so moving. And each chapter has focuses on one of the members of the family. There's 3 kids in this family, but most of it, as the title implies, focuses on the mother, who's it takes place in the 40s, I think, and so the mother is one of these housewives who doesn't work and is trying to figure out how to fit in society. She's kind of open-minded, but she's also, kind of burdened with a lot of the prejudices and the natural tendencies of women of that time. And of course, she's very eager to please her husband. So it just captures that time period in America in a really evocative way. And the writing is just beautiful, but also very kind of spare. So that book showed me that you don't have to have a storyline and a strong plot to create an incredible world of your own. And I incorporated that actually into my first novel, which jumps ahead in time in each chapter. In Open Spaces is the name of that book, and it incorporates a lot of that same approach. The next one is My Antonia, one of my favorite books ever. Willa Cather is the author. Willa Cather was from Nebraska. She was the first woman to ever win any major literary award, and it wasn't even for her best novel. Her best novels were My Antonia, Pioneers. What made Willa Cather incredible was that she wrote about the West in a way that most of the men writers were not. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that she was a woman. She didn't feel constrained by the same pressure of a lot of the men writers, I think. I'm just speculating, but it just seems that she had a lot more freedom to write openly about, alcoholism, domestic violence. There's a lot of just reality, authenticity to her books. My Antonia is about a young boy who's infatuated with his neighbor, Antonia, and it just captures, again, the reality and the authenticity of rural America in a way that's just so moving and beautiful. The next is Selected Stories by Anton Chekhov. Chekhov was considered the master of the short story. He never wrote a novel. He wrote incredible plays as well, but he was mainly known as a short story writer. And he has some simple but incredibly moving stories that just capture one moment. Like there's one called The Kiss, where a woman kisses this young soldier. He's at this party. He happens to stumble into this room where the light is off, and this woman comes in and kisses him, thinking he's someone else. And the way that it captures that story captures how this young man who's not a popular debonair, charming guy, how moved he is by this simple gesture, even though he knows it's an accident. So there's that one. There's another one. Oh boy, and I'm forgetting the title of it. But this young father turns up at a doctor's house late one night and tells him that his child needs help. And the doctor tells him, my wife just died just an hour ago. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to find someone else. And the guy convinces him to come with him anyway. So he goes with this guy. And it turns out the child has actually left. So the guy came under false pretenses, and of course, the growing rage that this doctor has, the longer this goes on, and when he comes to the realization of what happened, is just captured so well by Chekhov, who was just a brilliant student of human nature. And being a doctor himself, he had a lot of insights into how people interact and behave. So all of his stories are worth reading. But yeah, he also had a huge influence on someone who I almost put on my list, Raymond Carver, who wrote in a very similar style. The next is A Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. Carson McCullers was a Southern writer. She was a contemporary of Flannery O'Connor's. From what I've read, they probably didn't get along very well. In fact, I don't think very many people got along with Carson McCullers. She was a pretty bad alcoholic, had some mental issues as well. But she wrote incredible books. The Member of the Wedding is about this young girl. The book starts with her sister gets married, and as the couple is climbing into their car to go off on their honeymoon, the young girl tries to get in the car with them because she thinks she's going to be going with them on their honeymoon, and she's so devastated and pissed off when she doesn't get to go. So it goes from there into exploring how this young girl tries to navigate her way through the world. And this was another book, like Breakfast of Champions, where I read this book and I just had to read everything Carson McCullers wrote. And I loved almost all of her books. There was one kind of clunker in there, but she was an amazing writer, a very keen student of human behavior again. And she was also not afraid to delve into some of the darker corners of the human psyche. So her characters are not, warm and fuzzy. There's a lot of snarky behavior, a lot of very complicated dynamics going on, especially with the married couples in her stories. Highly recommend her. The next is a guy you might have heard of, William Shakespeare. I put down Macbeth, but anything. The reason I wanted to put him on this list is because when I was in graduate school, I was in the graduate program for creative writing. So most of the classes we took were writing classes, but we were also required to take a few literature classes. So I took a class that was fascinating called Violence in the Renaissance. And it focused on Shakespeare's plays, but also Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe. First of all, this class was so far above my head that I felt like a complete idiot. And I mean, everyone in this class except for me was in a doctorate program for literature. So they spoke a language I didn't even comprehend. They were always just I just sat there with my jaw dropped most of the time. In fact, the professor even called me in one time and he says, "Are you okay? Are you are you getting anything out of this class?" And I was like, "Yeah, I just don't have much to contribute." Anyway, one of the things that struck me about Shakespeare's plays, the more we read, and also these other writers, he understood that humans are capable of anything. His plays have some of the most diabolical characters in the history of literature, people who would do things that, you just can't even imagine. But because he was such an amazing writer, he was able to humanize these people. And it made me realize, you don't really need to think about any kind of boundaries when it comes to the characters you create. You can go as far as you want. Humans are definitely capable of anything. The main objective of writing is to make the reader believe that there's a reason for their behavior, and you might even empathize with the people, no matter how horrible they seem. So that was a revelation I had from that class, which I'll always appreciate, even though I didn't do well in that class. The next one is Sula by Toni Morrison. And I like this book for a similar reason, actually. So Toni Morrison, of course, was mostly known for Beloved, The Bluest Eye. I love those books too. Sula is a little more of an obscure one of her novels. But the thing I loved about Sula, it's about this young woman who's kind of the town floozy. I can't remember for sure if she's actually a prostitute or not. But at some point, the town decides to ban Sula from, exile her from this town. It's a small town, so she leaves. And what happens is that this town has a hole in it, and it's just a brilliant exploration of how every person in a small community like that serves a purpose. They're there. They have they they provide some kind of service, or they contribute in some way to the community, even if it's providing comfort for men who are lonely, or just seeking some kind of comfort here and there. So that book really touched me in ways that I didn't expect. Toni Morrison, of course, was absolutely brilliant, and we lost her not too long ago. The next one is Dubliners, James Joyce. And I think I discovered Joyce while I was in graduate school, if I remember right. I also read Ulysses, which is an incredible task, but oh my God, it's very rewarding if you're up for it. But Dubliners is his collection of short stories. Joyce was an absolutely meticulous writer. He savored language. The symbolism in his stories is just impeccable. In case you haven't seen it, there's a fabulous movie. It was actually the last movie that John Huston ever directed, called The Dead, which is adapted from Joyce's final story in this collection. If you haven't seen that film, please do. Joyce was really good at writing about longing, like people who are just desperately in love, or, just there's just something they want out of life that they're not getting. He was really good at that, capturing that spirit of the human condition. And of course, his language is just beautiful. The next book is the only nonfiction book on my list. It's called The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. So this book has a little bit of a backstory for me. Probably about 15 years ago, maybe even closer to 20, I fell in love with somebody and got married. I hadn't been in a long-term relationship for quite some time, and hadn't been married for I don't remember how long. But I actually moved across the country to get married to this person. And just 2 months after the wedding, her daughter was killed in a car accident, and it was her only child. It was a devastating event for everyone, of course. Um, it ended up being an incredibly it was a really hard time for me as far as trying to figure out what this all means and how to contend with it. I mean, the marriage didn't last very long after the accident. Um, and I was just trying to figure out how to deal with all this grief and this devastation, the trauma. And somebody told me about this book. So Joan Didion, she had a daughter who was incredibly ill, and she and her husband were just trying to deal with this ongoing illness, which eventually was fatal. But before the daughter died, they were sitting at the table one night, and Joan Didion's husband just suddenly collapsed into his plate and died right there. So Didion, of course, was completely shattered and just trying to figure out how to cope with this loss. And she ended up writing this book as a way of trying to understand what she was going through. And the thing I absolutely loved about The Year of Magical Thinking is that Didion really talks openly about how she doesn't agree with the typical American approach to grief, which is that you have to get through it, you have to get over it. She is very committed to the idea that um, that grief is a natural part of life. And so, she kind of pokes fun of the fact, well, she doesn't poke fun of it, but she talks about how Americans think that, exercise or pills or, going to groups and all those things are designed to help you get over your grief. And, she's just a huge proponent for embracing the grief and actually feeling it, because it's a way of honoring the person you've lost. It's not a way of, it doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong if you're feeling horrible about losing this person. So that was an important book for me emotionally, as far as trying to understand how to deal with this incredible trauma. The next book is a book called Every Man Dies Alone, and the author was a man named Hans Fallada. Hans Fallada was a German writer. He lived in Germany during the Second World War, and he was a completely devoted German citizen. So he, at a time when a lot of writers were leaving the country for obvious reasons, Fallada decided to stay. And he wrote these novels that were incredibly brave. And this one in particular, it's based on a true story about this older couple who decide that they are going to try to subvert Hitler's messaging. The man is I think he's a janitor or something. So he's a blue collar guy. He decides to write these postcards that are critical of Hitler. I mean, it's a laborious task for him because he's not very literate, but he's so devoted to it that he takes the time to write these postcards, and then he just leaves them in random places around, I think it's Munich. At that time, this was a punishable offense. Like, you could get killed for this. So what he was doing was incredibly brave and also dangerous. So eventually his wife started helping him. She didn't write them, but she would help distribute these postcards. And the funny thing about this story is that these postcards eventually came to the attention of the Gestapo, and they started collecting these cards, and they were convinced that it was some huge organization of resistance people. And eventually, the sad part of the story is that they eventually did figure out who it was. So this couple was arrested and died in prison. Very sad. But Falletta, he just writes about this couple, their complete devotion to trying to do something, trying to do whatever they could. And most of his books, this is another author that after I read this book, I just went, I've got to read everything this guy has written. And he was a very interesting writer. He was a drug addict and an alcoholic himself. So he wrote one book about that. He wrote another book about being a young married couple in Germany at the time. They're all very close to home about his life. He was also gay, closeted gay, so he had a very troubled life. In fact, he was in an institution for a while. He was an incredible writer, incredibly brave, authentic writer. The last book I'm going to talk about is As I Lay Dying, and this is William Faulkner. Faulkner is my favorite writer. The reason is because, when I was in graduate school, we talked a lot about some of the basic approaches to writing and how there's not really rules, but there's some things that you are encouraged not to do. And in some cases, there are some teachers who have a lot of those things, have a long list of those things. For me, it's always been, I always tell my students, the only rule about writing fiction is that there are no rules as long as you can make it work. If you try something and it's not coming across in a way that's meaningful or effective, then you should just give up on that. But Faulkner, of course, broke every rule. He had sentences that were pages long. He wrote from multiple points of view. He just was all over the map as far as his stylistic approach to writing. And sometimes it didn't work. I mean, he has a few novels that I just didn't really like. But for the most part, he's brilliant. And, the fact that he was able to do this while he was a bad alcoholic himself, and there were a lot of alcoholics in that generation of writers. He seems to be one of the few that continued to produce incredible work, even as his alcoholism became worse. As I Lay Dying is about a family that the mother dies. They've decided to take the body to the place where she grew up to bury her. Faulkner is funny in a lot of ways, but he's also just an incredible student of family dynamics. And of course, this family is very poor, so they're not equipped to deal with some of the conflict that comes their way. For example, there's a scene where one of the kids breaks his leg, set it in cement. So of course this leg gets gangrene and just stuff like that. It's a book that explores this family again, like one of the first books on my list, Mrs. Bridge. It explores this family dynamic from different points of view. Faulkner just makes it work. He captures the dynamics of this family. I came to appreciate Faulkner. The first time I tried to read him, I was completely overwhelmed. I didn't understand what the hell was going on. The more I learned about writing and the more I was able to appreciate people that take risks, the more I came to love Faulkner's writing. And I even read The Sound and the Fury and went, holy shit, this is incredible. So it's amazing how you can grow and learn to understand writers that you maybe didn't quite appreciate when you first started. So that's my list, 12 of my favorite books: Giants of the Earth, Breakfast of Champions, Mrs. Bridge, My Antonia, The Selected Stories of Anton Chekhov, A Member of the Wedding, Macbeth, Sula, Dubliners, The Year of Magical Thinking, Every Man Dies Alone, and As I Lay Dying. I also wanted to provide some honorable mentions. These are books that also impacted me a lot. Independent People by Halldór Laxness. He's an Icelandic writer, and that book is incredible. It has a lot of the same themes and undertones that Giants of the Earth has, but he captures the isolation of this farming family in a way that's incredible. What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, Raymond Carver, a collection of stories. And like Chekhov, Carver never wrote a novel, but he was the master of the short story. A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean, my fellow Montana writer. To me, this is the best Montana novel ever written. The Last Report on the Miracles at Little No Horse. That is a book by Louise Erdrich, and it's not one of her more popular books, but for me, it was the most amazing experiment in trying to tell a story from an incredibly unique point of view. Winter Wheat by Mildred Walker. She was also a Montana writer. I think that book was written in the 40s, perhaps, and it's just an amazing book. And then Lonesome Dove, Larry McMurtry, probably one of the best Westerns ever written, and absolutely one of the best Western films, which was actually a series, not a film, ever made. That, to me, is the gold standard of Westerns, Lonesome Dove. Thank you so much for listening. This is The Song of Rowland, and a podcast about American culture, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Talk to you again soon. I want to thank you all for joining me for this episode of The Song of Rowland. I have a couple of thank yous. I need to thank Stephen Gillis at Dzonk Books for sponsoring this podcast. I also need to thank Tiffany Hauk for producing this episode. Thank you to my son Fletcher for providing some of the transitional music. And join me again next time when I'm going to talk to Larry Watson, author of many novels, including Let Him Go, which was made into a film a couple of years ago with Kevin Costner and Diane Lane. Thanks again for joining me.